Should you show respect and love in your marriage? Well, respect and love are vital aspects of a successful marriage, aren't they? Almost all of us are concerned about marriage, that being our own or those of ones we love. And we do well to consider how vital respect and love are in a successful marriage. Now, respect may be demanded, but to come from another's heart, it must be earned. Now, Jesus earned respect as a teacher by his manner of teaching, didn't he? For an example of that, let's have a look at Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 and 29. So that's Matthew chapter 7, and it's 28 and 29, which reads, "Now when Jesus finished these sayings, the effect was that the crowds were astounded at his way of teaching, for he was teaching them as a person having authority and not as their scribes." So let us examine the role of a husband in connection with respect in marriage. Now, the wife is taught to respect her husband, and how can the husband merit it? Well, let's have a look at Ephesians chapter 5, verse 33 for the answer. That's Ephesians chapter 5, and it's verse 33. "Nevertheless, also let each one of you individually so love his wife as he does himself. On the other hand, the wife should have deep respect for her husband." So we get the gist there, don't we? Now, the ways a husband earns his wife's deep respect is by exercising proper headship. Now, examples of loving headship are found in Jehovah's headship over Christ and Christ's headship over the congregation. Let's have a look at a few scriptural examples of that, shall we? Let's have a look at Matthew chapter 11, verse 29. That's Matthew chapter 11, and it's verse 29. "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am mild-tempered and lowly in heart, and you will find refreshment for your souls. For my yoke is kindly and my load is light." Also, if we look at Hebrews chapter 10, that's Hebrews chapter 10, and we're looking at verse 7. Now that tells us, "Then I said, Look, I am come in the roll of a book it is written about me, to do your will, O God." So a husband should follow these examples. And if we turn back to Ephesians chapter 5, that's Ephesians chapter 5, and the verse we're going to look at is verses 25 through to 29, and also verse 33. So that's chapter 5, from verse 25 it says, "Husbands, continue loving your wives, just as the Christ also loved the congregation and delivered up himself for it, that he might sanctify it, cleansing it with the bath of water by means of a word, that he might present the congregation to himself in its splendour, not having a spot or wrinkle or any such things, but that it should be holy and without blemish. In this way husbands ought to be loving their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no man ever hated his own flesh, but he feeds and cherishes it, as the Christ also does the congregation." So moving on to verse 33 then, it says, "Nevertheless, also let each one of you individually so love his wife as he does himself. On the other hand, the wife should have deep respect for her husband." So, on the other hand, when the husband is domineering, the wife's submission to him can be a hardship, can't it? And if a husband refuses to take the lead and make needed decisions in the family, the wife's submission is difficult and she may feel forced to take over to get things done. Now, the husband is to be steady and strong in making decisions, but should take into consideration the views of his wife. So, by being a good provider, the husband is to provide materially for his wife, isn't he? Shall we have a look at a scriptural principle for that? It might be one that you've seen already, but let's have a look at 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5, and it's verse 8, and that tells us, "Certainly, if anyone does not provide for those who are his own, and especially for those who are members of his household, he has disowned the faith, and is worse than a person without faith." So that's quite serious, that, isn't it? And in providing materially, the man is not to go to extremes and become materialistic, involving his family in that snare. So let's have a look at that actually. So just in the next chapter, 1 Timothy chapter 6. So that's 1 Timothy chapter 6, and it's verses 7 to 10 we'll look at there. It says, "For we have brought nothing into the world, and neither can we carry anything out. So having sustenance and covering, we shall be content with these things. However, those who are determined to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many senseless and hurtful desires, which plunge men into destruction and ruin." Isn't that quite right? So he must balance his providing materially with a more vital need of making spiritual provisions for his family. Just going back to 1 Timothy chapter 6, let's just continue from there, from verse 17 to 19. Now it says, "Give orders to those who are rich in the present system of things not to be high-minded, and to rest their hope not on uncertain riches, but on God, who furnishes us all things richly for our enjoyment. To work at good, to be rich in fine works, to be liberal, ready to share, safely treasuring up for themselves a fine foundation for the future, in order that they may get a firm hold of the real life." So by showing his wife honour as to a weaker vessel, or the feminine one, he shows a great deal of respect to his wife, doesn't he? Now let's have a look at 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, and now that tells us, "You husbands continue dwelling in like manner with them according to knowledge, assigning them honour as to a weaker vessel, the feminine one, since you are also heirs with them of the undeserved favour of life, in order for your prayers not to be hindered." So if a husband failed to treat his wife as a weaker vessel and to mistreat her, then his prayers could actually be hindered, couldn't they? And that's true in sexual relations as well, and by maintaining good personal hygiene or cleanliness. Now, never treating your woman as and a husband would never want to treat his wife as inferior just because she may be physically weaker. Now, so let's look at a scriptural principle there. Let's have a look at Ephesians chapter 5 again. Ephesians chapter 5, and we're going to look at verse 28. We'll highlight that one there, and it tells us, "In this way, husbands ought to be loving their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself." So, we see there that, it's very important for a husband to love his wife as if he was loving himself there. So, manifesting awareness of her emotional makeup and a desire to feel needed, to be talked to, and to be remembered, and to be told that she is loved. So a lot of people say that actions speak louder than words, in which they do, but it's also a very good idea to actually express that love that you have for your wife in words, isn't it? But what about the wife? And how does love, which we mentioned as vital, fit in with that? Well, the husband is told to love his wife, but she must act lovingly if he is to do this from his heart. Now, she should be a helper, supporting her husband in his decisions. Now, a wife ought to train herself to be capable in performing her wifely duties. Should we have a look at the scriptural principle for that one in Proverbs chapter 31, verse 27. So Proverbs 31, and it's verse 27. She is watching over the goings on of her household, and the bread of laziness she does not eat. So she should care for her personal appearance, yet remember that the most important adornment is a fine disposition. Let's just go a few verses back to verse 20 to begin with. Now that tells us, her palm she has stretched out to the afflicted one, and her hands she has thrust out to the poor one. Verse 26, her mouth she has opened in wisdom, and the law of loving kindness is upon her tongue. And just moving on to verse 30, charm may be false, and prettiness may be vain, but the woman that fears Jehovah is the one that procures praise for herself. So we see there those qualities there that a woman needs to put on, as it were, as if she was adorning herself with clothing. Now, the wife, like the husband, is to conduct herself with fairness and consideration in sexual matters. Just moving on to Hebrews chapter 13. Hebrews chapter 13. Now that tells us here in verse 4, let marriage be honourable among all, and the marriage bed be without defilement, for God will judge fornicators and adulterers. So there are pitfalls that the wife should avoid if she is to be loved. Now, the wife who resorts to weeping to get her own way loses her husband's respect. Now we can see an example of this in Judges chapter 14. So that's Judges chapter 14. Judges chapter 14, verses 16 and 17. Now that tells us, consequently, Samson's wife began to weep over him and to say, you only hate me, you do, and you do not love me. There was a riddle that you propounded to the sons of my people, but to me you have not told it. At this he said to her, why, to my own father and my own mother I have not told it, and I ought to tell it to you? But she kept weeping over him for 7 days, that the banquet continued for them. And it came about on the 7th day that finally he told her, because she had pressured him. And she told the riddle to the sons of her people. So we see there that how she's trying to get her own way over Samson there, wasn't she? Now, a nagging wife jeopardises her marriage and kills love, doesn't she? So let's have a look at Judges chapter 16, verse 16, which is just over the page. Now that tells us there, and it came about that because she pressured him with her words all the time and kept urging him, his soul got to be impatient to the point of dying. Now, looking at verse 17 there, it says, finally he disclosed to her all his heart and said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, because I am a Nazarite of God, from my mother's belly. If I did get shaved, my power also would certainly depart from me, and I should indeed grow weak and become like all other men. So the wife who wants her husband to talk to her should not inhibit his doing so by her controversial habits. Now let's have a look on this score at Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 7. That's Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 7. Now that tells us a time to rip apart, a time to sew together, a time to keep quiet, and a time to speak. So a wife who has an unbelieving husband must not preach excessively to him, but let her conduct recommend the Christian way. So let's have a look at Proverbs chapter 16 verse 24. Proverbs chapter 16 and it's verse 24. Pleasant sayings are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and a healing to the bones. Just moving on to chapter 25, just a few pages over, we'll look at verse 11 of chapter 25, and that tells us, "There's apples of gold in silver carvings, in a word spoken at the right time for it." So we see how important that is there, don't we? Now, for love that is a perfect bond of union in marriage. Now, the Bible provides an inspired definition of love. Now, have you seen this verse here? Let's have a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And that tells us there from... we're going to look at verses 4 to 8 there, so let's have a look at that. Now that tells us, "Love is long-suffering and kind. Love is not jealous. It does not brag. It does not get puffed up. Does not behave indecently. Does not look for its own interests. Does not become provoked. It does not keep account of the injury. It does not rejoice over unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." Isn't that just right, particularly in the marriage relationship there? Now, another thing to do is make love grow. And love is like a muscle, and the more you use it, the more strengthened it gets by use, doesn't it? Now, we need to increase love also by sharing in it. And serving your mate makes that love grow as well, doesn't it? So with the conduct that we've outlined here, so love can grow whether your mate is a Christian believer or not. Now, we need to keep on increasing respect and love in our marriages. So husbands, they need to show love and respect in their marriage. Now let's have a look at 1 Peter chapter 3 verses 8 and 9. That's 1 Peter chapter 3 and it's verses 8 and 9. "Finally, all of you be like-minded, showing fellow feeling, having brotherly affection, tenderly compassionate, humble in mind, not paying back injury for injury, or reviling for reviling, but to the contrary bestowing a blessing, because you were called to this course, so that you might inherit a blessing." So we do not feel that it is just enough to bring home wages in a marriage. Of course, the husband has that responsibility to provide for his family, physically and materially, doesn't he? But he shouldn't feel that that is just all he has to do. He needs to continue to deepen his appreciation for his wife, doesn't he? And to try and overlook her faults and forgive her weaknesses. Now, wives also need to cultivate deep respect for their husbands. So it be a true compliment to him, supporting him and helping him with his load. Now, they need to cultivate appreciation for him and work to make him happy. And in this way, you and the entire family will be happy. Now let's have a look at probably quite a well-known verse, but let's have a look at Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20. I have exhibited to you in all things that by thus labouring you must assist those who are weak, and must bear in mind the words of Lord Jesus, when he himself said, there is more happiness in giving than there is in receiving.